Welcome back to Wide Angle. We are discussing the issue of eliminating nuclear weapons. Patricia just spoke about the lack of progress in the United Nations on this particular theme, and she spoke about groupings of like-minded countries. How do you see this particular shift towards groupings of like-minded countries?
I think the problem, given the specialized nature of nuclear weapons and the fact that they were possessed only by a few countries, traditionally I think the great power politics tended to dominate the debates on nuclear weapons and their reduction. So while initially there were attempts in the UN through a variety of forums to regulate this through a multilateral framework, it's really from the beginning, it was say the partial test ban treaty was negotiated by Britain, United States and Soviet Russia, and then the bilateral arms control between Americans and the Russians, that tended to dominate the whole discourse. But and the forums like Conference on Disarmament have become largely infructuous, and the great power differences, for example, that we can't have a negotiation on capping the production of special nuclear materials because America and China have a problem over missile defenses. So I think the great power domination of the global order continues to limit. But as Patricia said, look, there's some cases, for example, on Landmines Convention, on a range of other things where the collective, sometimes even non-governmental actors have pushed the world order to take into account the new concerns. But when it comes to the big issues, still, it is still the big boys deciding that. And my fear is that even in cybersecurity, outer space where the capabilities are concentrated in the hands of few, they tend to set the agenda, and they'll use the multilateral forums to do some stuff like non-proliferation or to create general norms for others, while the principal reduction of weapons of mass destruction still remains in the hands of the big boys. And the alternative example, of course, we had the Chemical Weapons Convention, which took, say, going back to the late 19th century when the first attempts were made. It took almost 80-90 years to ban it. Here too, someday, I hope it will happen, but it's going to be a long uphill struggle.
Although in the case of chemical weapons, the norm against use of chemical weapons, which was laid down in 1920, was a norm that held. It held through World War II, for example. And therefore, even though chemical weapons were eventually only eliminated in the 1990s, but the norm against them held to a very great extent. So in that sense, there is already a norm against use of nuclear weapons, because after 1945, nuclear weapons have not been used. And we hope that this norm continues. So how do we use the normative approach to contribute to the elimination effort?
I think that's a really good question. We are, as human beings, very influenced by what each other does and how each other behaves. And also within a moral ethical framework, for the most part, human beings want to live their lives in a way that makes them feel proud. So I think that this is a really strong approach, and it has demonstrated its worth, as you say, with chemical weapons. And if it hadn't been for the 1920s and the Geneva Protocol, we would not have been able to hold Syria to account in its use of chemical weapons. And who has chemical weapons now? Almost nobody. There's a queue awaiting destruction still in Russia and America, and almost everyone's got rid of whatever old stocks that it had. And who would have believed that 20 years ago? So this normative approach, I think, actually has this sort of drip by drip influence on the way we behave and what we actually do, which in the end is what matters most.
Now, with the expansion of the terrorist threat, we hear many more concerns being expressed about the possibility of nuclear terrorism. Was that an issue that was discussed at your conference?
Yeah, I think that this has become a central issue because in the age of terror that we've gone through in the last 20 odd years, and the spread of the nuclear industry, the widespread distribution of nuclear materials, those that can be used by groups. So what we've seen in the last decade is really to tighten the various procedures. I mean, to criminalize activity that could lead to nuclear terrorism within domestic law, a greater cooperation through the so-called Nuclear Security Summit, where countries are beginning to adopt rules and norms that would reduce the chances of these falling into the hands of terrorists. I mean, that's one part. The other part is that what India had to face, that it is not that nuclear terrorism has another meaning, which is using the nuclear balance, as our neighbor to the west has done, which is to, once you're the immunity that the nuclear weapons provide, you unleash a subconventional conflict. And that, I think, is going to be far more difficult to handle. And I think that challenge, I think we'll have to devote a lot more attention. How do we make sure that once a country has nuclear weapons, it does not use that to actually do something below the level of nuclear weapons?
Thank you. Let us take this opportunity to listen to what some of the other experts had to say.
I think in order for a world without nuclear weapons to be at least as safe and secure as one with a world nuclear weapon, to be at least as safe and secure as a world with nuclear weapons, you'd have to have effective verification, effective enforcement, and the states that have nuclear weapons would have to be able to protect their vital interest without those nuclear weapons. So those are the three challenges as I see them.
Very deep interest in how we make the transition from a world which presently anchors both national and international security in nuclear weapons held by 9 nuclear armed states, to a different world which is free of nuclear weapons, but is actually more stable and more secure. As we have seen with democratization, the risks are in the transition rather than after we have arrived at the destination of a nuclear-free world.
There is much disappointment about the UN machinery. It's good that the deliberations, but most of the action has been taking place outside the UN. And specifically, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva has had nothing to do, or it has been able to do nothing since the conclusion of the comprehensive test ban, because of the consensus rule. It requires a consensus to agree on a program of action, and that makes it very difficult to channel important concerns through the Conference on Disarmament. Therefore, much of the action is taking place outside the UN.
I think first of all it's quite important that India demonstrate its activeness in this particular field, and I think that participants have been impressed that Prime Minister came and made a speech. There is clear understanding that it will take time to negotiate a comprehensive treaty to eliminate all nuclear weapons.
For the nuclear weapon states, if there was a universal no first use treaty, which has also been India's position, the Prime Minister, elaborated that in his speech as well. The reassurance comes for the nuclear weapon states that they're not going to be using the nuclear weapon against each other. So if it becomes a weapon which is not usable, neither against the non-nuclear weapon states nor against the nuclear weapon states, eventually the weapon loses its value and we get to a state where we can be in a nuclear weapons-free world.
I would say that it's a kind of a snapshot of the major transitions that are taking place in the world, and it is very important to have that snapshot. There is no finality as yet where the world is going, and so there is no finality how to really approach a world without nuclear weapons. But it is important to have different perspectives which are coming from different countries.
Coming back to the issue of nuclear terrorism, we have also seen 3 nuclear security summits that have taken place in the last, since 2010?
Yes.
How do you think these have helped in terms of strengthening the norm against nuclear weapons?
I think they've been very helpful, and I think all of these sort of, if you like, supportive measures that have been put in place to support the wider regime have all been helpful. What I see it as a form of preventive measure. If you take the issue of nuclear terrorism, for example, we're unlikely to see the spread of nuclear weapons to terrorist organizations. We're quite likely to see the spread of radiological materials. But the idea of thinking about it in advance, preventing those materials getting to them, bringing in countries that otherwise wouldn't work together to decide on what they will do for the cause has been a really remarkable achievement, I would say, from President Obama.
India has a unique position in the field of nuclear disarmament because we have continued to take initiatives in this field almost since our independence. And we have continued to do so even after 1998, when India declared itself a nuclear weapons state. This conference was, I'm told, was one of the very new conferences that has taken place with this level of expertise. How do you look at India's role in this particular field? How do we continue to take more initiatives in this regard? Raja?
I think that, as you said, India has had a special role. I mean, I think which the Prime Minister also referred to, that India was, even after his first test, that it was reluctant to actually build a nuclear weapons program. And it's had a history from the beginning when Nehru called for a nuclear standstill in the 1950s. India was an active player in the original 18-nation Committee on Disarmament, etc. But I think today, it's because of the dynamic in Asia and the Middle East, it's become far more complicated. And it's not merely an idealist or a rhetorical issue, that it needs more practical activism to be engaged in specifics, like in the Middle East. I think India needs to do more in terms of participating, promoting this reconciliation between US and Iran, make sure that what comes out has a reasonable chance of success. Similarly in the East as well, I mean, I think on the North Korea issue. On the key negotiations, India today is absent because of the way this has played itself out. So I think in some senses, a rising India must, besides the UN activism, must also do more in the regions. One is to our east, one is to our west, to deal with the nuclear issue.
Thank you, Dr. Patricia Lewis. Thank you, Dr. Rajamohan. This brings us to the end of this edition of Wide Angle.